Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening. My name's Emily Gebbia. I am the Associate Director for Regulatory Development in CDER's Office of Compliance, Office of Scientific Investigations. I'm happy to be here today to talk to you about FDA's use of alternative approaches to evaluate GCP compliance. I have the privilege, honor of being the last presentation of this 3-day course. And of course, I don't want to keep you any longer, so I will just go ahead and jump right in. So my learning objectives for, again, what is the last presentation of this course. First, we'll take a quick look at the changes in the clinical trial ecosystem that are impacting FDA's approach to evaluating compliance with good clinical practice. Next, I'll discuss some of these approaches in more detail. Specifically, we'll talk about evaluating GCP compliance through the use of remote regulatory assessments, through FDA's collaborations with foreign regulatory counterparts, and finally, we'll talk about FDA's approach to evaluating GCP compliance in clinical trials with innovative design elements, many of which you've heard discussed during this course already. But before we can talk about where we're going, we have to talk about where we've been. So inspections, as you probably know, are on-site evaluations of the conduct of a clinical investigation. So these have been and will continue to be the backbone of FDA's oversight of GCP compliance. Inspections have long been supported by more limited investigations and some information sharing with foreign regulatory counterparts. And traditionally, FDA has conducted these inspections consistent with our written compliance programs. And these compliance programs really are intended to ensure a robust evaluation of all of the aspects of the conduct and reporting of a clinical trial. But just because something has worked well doesn't mean that there aren't other ways of doing things. And of course, sometimes changes in an ecosystem necessitate thinking differently. And this is certainly true in the clinical trial space. So let's talk briefly about what some of those changes are. The first is globalization. Obviously, the movement toward global clinical trials has been happening for quite some time, and they're really now ubiquitous. I'll describe in some detail later that the majority of participants in clinical trials that are submitted to CDER in support of a marketing application are located outside of the United States. Another change in clinical trials has been increasing complexity. We're seeing not only an increase in the amount of data collected in a trial, but also increases in the number and variety of data sources and in the number and types of providers and vendors involved in helping to manage trials. Even efforts to streamline or simplify trials can add their own complexity when it reflects a new approach that increases uncertainty. Finally, we saw with the COVID-19 public health emergency really an acceleration in the adoption of many of the innovations in clinical trials that before the pandemic were just being discussed or considered theoretically. They were deployed immediately to meet a public health need, but we ended up, building the airplane while we were flying it. So, overall, these changes are for the good. There's more opportunities to accelerate the development of therapies and improve patient outcomes, to improve diversity, equity, inclusion in trials, to reduce costs, enhance safety, and improve our data quality and integrity. But they do raise challenges for regulatory oversight. The one-size-fits-most approach that I showed on the last slide is sometimes a poor fit for today's complex global environment. So we're going to talk about some of the ways that FDA is addressing this. And the first is through remote regulatory assessments. So FDA issued a revised draft guidance on conducting remote regulatory assessments, or RRAs, in January 2024. The guidance explains that an RRA is an examination of an FDA-regulated establishment and/or its records conducted entirely remotely to evaluate compliance with applicable FDA requirements. The first GCP remote evaluation occurred in May 2020, not long after FDA had to postpone domestic and international inspections because of the pandemic. This was obviously before the draft guidance had been issued. So our experiences during the pandemic were essentially real-time experiments in the use of this method to evaluate GCP compliance. And fortunately, it demonstrated a number of benefits, including allowing FDA to gain compliance insight when it couldn't inspect, informing future inspection planning, and most significantly, enabling us to support the review and timely approval and authorization of marketing submissions to FDA. The RRA guidance that was recently released is really informed by FDA's experiences during the pandemic. So I told you a little bit about what RRAs are, but it's also important to understand what RRAs are not. So RRAs are not inspections. Generally, an inspection, as described in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, involves officers or employees of FDA physically entering an establishment. There's no physical entry as part of an RRA, and RRAs aren't intended to limit the authority of FDA to conduct inspections, but really complement that authority. RRAs are also not something you can ask for. FDA does not accept requests to perform an RRA, but intends to use a risk-based approach to determine whether it would be appropriate to request or initiate an RRA in a specific case. And in making that determination, FDA considers a number of factors, including the location of the establishment, its inspection history, the complexity of the product and processes to be inspected, and any travel restrictions. As we gain experience with RRAs, we're really learning sort of how those factors play and when and where RRAs are most useful. And finally, RRAs are not intended to limit or replace other ways FDA gets information. So I just said that they are a complement to our inspection authority, but RRAs also don't change our existing practices with respect to, for example, issuing an information request or holding a meeting or otherwise communicating with applicants and other regulated entities as necessary. So let's dig into RRAs a bit more. First, it's important to know that RRAs describes a category of activities that might have different names, including remote interactive evaluations or remote record reviews. All of these are types of RRAs. The guidance also describes both mandatory and voluntary RRAs. Mandatory RRAs are conducted under a legal authority that mandates the establishment's participation. As relevant to clinical investigators, this would be Section 704A4 of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which gives the FDA authority to request and requires establishments to provide records that could be inspected under 704 in advance or in lieu of an inspection. Refusing to participate in a mandatory RRA by failing to respond to FDA, by withdrawing participation, or by refusing to provide the records that are requested could be a violation of the Act and could subject an establishment to enforcement action. Voluntary RRAs, on the other hand, are not conducted under a legal authority. This may either be because participation is not required under a legal authority, so there isn't an applicable legal authority, or because FDA chooses not to invoke the authority that it has and instead requests voluntary participation. There's no enforcement action that's initiated if establishment declines to participate, but there are good reasons to participate. If the establishment declines, FDA may need to initiate some other kind of way of getting the information, such as an inspection. And if it can't do an inspection and the establishment declines to participate, FDA may not be able to get the information that it needs to make a regulatory decision. If a company or establishment is thinking about declining participating voluntarily because it has concerns about its ability to participate from a technological or other perspective, it should really discuss those concerns with FDA before declining. Clinical investigator RAs initiated by CDER typically are voluntary, And you will know if an RRA is mandatory or voluntary because FDA will tell you. For mandatory RRAs, FDA intends to make clear the specific authority under which the RRA is being initiated. And for voluntary RRAs, we do request sort of affirmative confirmation of willingness to participate. So one of the goals of the guidance is to promote greater consistency in the way RRAs are conducted, and it provides a lot of information about the process for RRAs. I'm going to talk through this process, focusing on the types of RRAs the BIMO program has primarily used, which are interactive remote evaluations. And interactive remote evaluations are a type of voluntary RRA that include virtual interactions during the virtual assessment, so not just passing documents back and forth. So the first step for an RRA is the RRA request, and this is confirming with the establishment their willingness to participate. Usually FDA will reach out by email or phone to explain the purpose and the planned scope of the RRA, and as I mentioned previously, confirm the entity's willingness to participate. After the RRA request is made and the establishment confirms its willingness to participate, FDA will have an opening meeting with the site. Either before the opening meeting or during it, FDA will go over the technological requirements for the RRA and determine the best logistical approaches in collaboration with the establishment. Also during the opening meeting, FDA will discuss its expectations for the RRA. It'll set up the schedule for virtual interviews and meetings. It'll talk about the process and timelines and address any questions that the establishment has. Importantly, unlike an opening meeting for an inspection, an FDA Form 482 is not issued at the opening of an RRA. During the RRA, just like during an inspection, FDA will request and review records and other information. Your documents may be shared via a cloud file sharing solution or viewed via screen sharing or live stream video. That'll be worked out between the investigator or inspector and the entity. There will also be virtual meetings daily or as needed during the RRA to get additional information from the site and to learn about its operations, the conduct of the study, the processes and procedures, and ask questions. One virtual meeting at the end is the closeout meeting. So during this meeting, FDA will discuss any findings it observed during the RRA. Just like there's no 482 at the opening, there will not be a 483 issued at the close of an RRA, but FDA will provide, if appropriate, a list of written observations. And just like an inspection, establishments are encouraged to provide a written response to FDA if there are any written observations within 15 days. After the RRA is complete, the FDA investigator writes an RRA report with its preliminary findings and observations. This is sent to the center reviewer who confirms, in the case of a BIMO inspection supporting an application, for an example, the reliability of the data, looks at compliance with FDA's requirements, and ultimately communicates the findings of the RRA back to the establishment. Once the review of the RRA is complete and a letter is issued, the RRA is closed. Unlike inspections, RRAs are not currently classified as NAI, VAI, or OAI, but if FDA identifies violations of regulatory significance, it can take an administrative or regulatory action following an RRA, such as issuing a warning letter or placing a study on clinical hold based on the findings. Okay, so we've talked through a lot of what's on this slide already, but I just wanted to provide a visual comparison here of RRAs and inspections, where they overlap and how they're different. I like to think of myself as somebody who focuses on the things that bring us together instead of divide us. So let's start by looking at where there's overlap here. And I hope you'll agree that these are really the most substantive characteristics of FDA's oversight. So Where there's overlap is, the purpose of the operation to verify study data and to evaluate compliance. And in the outcome, the potential follow-up actions really are the same, regardless of the type of operation. Whereas the differences are more process-related, the kinds of forms that are used or not, the nomenclature for the report, and sort of those sorts of factors. As we sort of finish here with RRAs, I just wanted to provide a little bit of practical information. Just like anything else, a successful RRA requires preparation. And here are some of the things that you can do if you're contacted by FDA to participate in an RRA to help make sure it's successful. The first is to commit the same level of importance and attention that you would for an inspection. So having a dedicated team, making sure you have the necessary support staff, and sort of participating fully. The second is clarifying with FDA any requests you don't fully understand or that will require submission of a lot of records. Make sure that you understand the scope of the request. And once you do, make sure that the requested documents are organized in an easy to understand format. This makes it much easier for FDA to complete its review and for the RRA to go smoothly. Number 4 is staff, and this means having the relevant subject matter experts available to answer questions during the RRA. And finally, Connect is really intended to, again, highlight having the appropriate technology infrastructure to support the RRA, and as noted before, that this would be discussed with FDA to make sure that the technology solutions were appropriate for everybody. Okay, so as we wrapped up RRAs, I do have a challenge question for you, and that is the following. Which of the following is true for remote regulatory assessments? A, they're always mandatory. B, they begin with FDA presenting credentials and issuing a 482. C, they may involve interactive elements such as screen sharing. Or D, they may result in issuance of a FDA 483. And the correct answer is C. They may involve interactive elements such as screen sharing. Remote interactive evaluations, as I mentioned, are a type of RRA. But for RRAs, as we said, they can be voluntary or mandatory. And we don't currently issue a 482 or 483 for an RRA, although there may be a follow-up compliance or regulatory action as appropriate. So now I'd like to shift gears a little bit and spend a few minutes talking about how FDA's collaborations with foreign regulatory counterparts play a role in our oversight of good clinical practice compliance. As I promised at the beginning, I do have some data to share about the location of clinical trial participants in studies submitted to CDER in support of marketing applications. This first chart shows data from FDA's Drug Trials Snapshot Summary Report for 2023, which included for the first time information on the location of study participants. Data was available for 54 of the 55 novel approvals covered in the report, and in the study supporting those approvals, 33% of participants were in the U.S. and 67% were outside of the U.S. This was actually consistent with a report from 2016 looking at clinical trials for products approved that year, which found that 31% of participants were in the U.S. and 69% were at foreign sites. This chart, however, shows the location of FDA inspection activities for inspections conducted in support of marketing applications between 2018 and 2023. We see the inverse of the first chart. Around 65 to 70% of FDA inspections in support of marketing applications occur domestically in the U.S. and 30 to 35% occur outside the U.S. So this just really highlights the need for a strong collaborative environment with foreign regulatory counterparts for oversight of clinical trials. And here is information about some of the international collaborations we rely on in OSI to support the BIMO program. First, we have started in 2009 our collaboration with EMA, which was joined by PDMA in 2017. We also have a collaboration with MHRA that was started in 2016 and that Health Canada joined in 2020. FDA is also a member of the Pharmaceutical Inspection Cooperation Scheme, or PICS, and participates in its Good Clinical Practice Group and its Joint Visits Program, which allows for comparison of inspection procedures and techniques. So, to what end is all of this international collaboration? Well, the key objectives are really to share information to support inspection planning and to share information about inspection outcomes, and then to discuss information about GCP-related legislation, guidance, and policy. We also, through these collaborations, conduct either observational or joint inspections. Observational inspections are where we participate, or where we will just observe another regulator's inspection, and joint inspections are where both regulators will be conducting an inspection of the same entity at the same time. Since the inception of our international collaborations, we've conducted over 150 observational or joint inspections, shared more than 680 documents, and held more than 20 meetings a year. All of this allows us to gain a better understanding of each other's processes and procedures. It really provides a more efficient use of resources for inspections and for regulatory decision making. It improves our inspection coverage, avoids duplication, and hopefully leads to a greater consistency in global regulatory approaches. So I'd like to spend the remainder of my time talking about FDA's approach to evaluating GCP in clinical trials with innovative designs. Rather than focusing on the method or the type of operation, whether it's an inspection or RA, these are really considerations that are relevant to evaluating GCP compliance regardless of the operation type, but that take into consideration the trial design and operations. It's important to remember that FDA's GCP regulations apply to clinical investigations regardless of the design or innovations used. Really, the question is how the requirements apply when we are talking about what might be considered a non-traditional trial and how we evaluate compliance. The recently released draft guidance integrating randomized controlled trials for drug and biological products into routine clinical practice touches on this. And it talks about how for BIMO inspections, really we want to assess the practices and procedures that are likely to have a meaningful impact on the reliability of the results and on the right safety and well-being of participants. These aspects vary from trial to trial, and it's why it's so important, as discussed in other presentations during this course, to really incorporate quality by design and quality risk management into trials. This is especially true when we're talking about innovative approaches that have less familiarity. So we're going to look at a few different types of innovations and ways this can play out. First, I need to give a really quick overview of FDA's definitions of real-world data and real-world evidence, which can be incorporated into innovative clinical trial designs. So real-world data are data relating to patient health status and/or the delivery of health care that are routinely collected from a variety of sources. What does that mean? So the examples that we have, this is data from electronic health care records, from a clinician, insurance claims data from disease registries or other kinds of registries, and some data from digital health technologies. Real-world evidence is clinical evidence about the use and potential benefits or risks of a medical product that is derived from an analysis of real-world data. So now that we're all experts on real-world data and real-world evidence, we'll look at how FDA evaluates GCP compliance for studies that involve real-world data or real-world evidence. Regardless of the source of data, it has to be sufficient to support regulatory decision-making. And to evaluate the data for that purpose, FDA is looking for a few things. The first is access to source data for source data verification. FDA understands and does not expect that real-world data will be collected in accordance with GCP, but to understand whether it's sufficiently reliable to support regulatory decision-making, FDA will conduct inspections or RRAs to assess the source data for compliance with Alcoa principles and good documentation practices, and to understand and assess changes that are made to the data as it verifies the sponsor's data line listings. Generally, real-world data are inspected at the site level or the location of the source documentation. FDA is also going to assess data quality. This is typically as part of a sponsor inspection to make sure that the processes and procedures for data collection were consistent, to assess data integrity and security, and to look at any issues that occur with data collection. And then also as part of a sponsor inspection, FDA will evaluate the transparency in the processes and procedures for data curation, transformation, and analysis, including assuring that the data are transferred completely without omissions or errors, and assessing validated data transfers. So another type of innovation is digital health technology, or DHTs, and these are often incorporated into the design of innovative clinical trials. They include, for example, wearables and software applications. FDA has a guidance on digital health technologies for remote data acquisition and clinical investigations, and it describes important considerations for FDA's evaluation of GCP compliance in trials incorporating these technologies. First, it clarifies that FDA does not intend to inspect individual DHTs for source data if the data captured by the DHT are securely transferred to and retained in a durable electronic data repository, and that transfers according to the sponsor's pre-specified plan. If that is the case, then for inspection purposes, FDA will consider the source data to be the data in the first durable electronic database to which the data are transferred. Another clinical trial innovation is decentralization. As you may recall from other presentations during this course, decentralized elements are elements that allow trial-related activities to occur remotely at locations convenient for participants, such as telehealth visits, visits with local healthcare providers, and in-home study visits. Decentralized elements have long been used in clinical trials, but we see an increase in the number of trials using them and in the number of elements used in one trial itself. In some cases, you may even have trials that are completely decentralized, as shown in the image here, where the investigator is providing oversight, making decisions from a central location. In this case, all the study visits with the investigator are through the telehealth platform. And there's also data that's collected from DHTs, like we just talked about, and from local healthcare providers. The recently published guidance on conducting trials with decentralized elements discusses inspections of trials with decentralized elements. It takes into account the non-traditional nature of these trials by describing flexibility for investigators, for clinical investigator inspections to occur, where the records can be reviewed and the necessary personnel interviewed, even if that isn't at a location that might be a typical site location. Okay, so that was a whirlwind through some of FDA's alternative approaches. I do have a second challenge question for you that relates back to our crash course on real-world data. And the question is, which of the following is not real-world data? Data collected in electronic healthcare records during routine clinical care. Data collected by a study nurse during a study visit at the investigator's site. Data from insurance claims for healthcare provider services. Or data from a disease-specific registry. And the answer is B, data collected by a study nurse during a study visit at the investigator's site, because this data is being collected specifically for the purposes of the trial and not routinely as part of the participant's health care. So at the beginning of my presentation, I shared a slide similar to this one and talked about how FDA's approach to evaluating GCP compliance has historically been carried out through inspections that cover the entire relevant compliance program. I described changes in the clinical trial ecosystem that have created the opportunity for FDA to also evolve its approach to GCP oversight. And I highlighted some of these, including FDA's use of remote regulatory assessments, its increasing collaboration with foreign regulatory counterparts, and its fit-for-purpose approach to inspections of clinical trials with innovative approaches and design elements. So what does the future look like? We're taking the lessons we've learned from the pandemic and working on formalizing and maturing our processes and procedures so that we have a robust set of well-defined and fit-for-purpose oversight options that can be deployed as appropriate. And in carrying out our oversight activities, we want to be in a position to be able to take approaches that are flexible and efficient to maximize our resources while robustly supporting regulatory decision-making. Thank you for your attention here at the end of this course. I look forward to our panel discussion, and I'm happy to turn things over to Dr. Smith to kick that off.